CGTN, China Global Television Network.
China's President Xi Jinping held a special virtual summit this week with his African counterparts to discuss the COVID-19 situation on the continent and China's proposed and ongoing anti-pandemic interventions to boost Africa's fight against COVID-19. The summit takes place as the world remains delicately positioned on the edge with a huge cost to lives and economies. Africa's situation remains both precarious and uncertain, and the continent has called for global assistance and cooperation in containing the contagion, which makes this summit critical and timely for Africa, as China and Africa look to reinvigorate their historical relations and partnership. So what are the outcomes of this summit, and what will these developments mean for the continent's fight against COVID-19? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. An extraordinary summit at an extraordinary time. Owing to global restrictions on movement following the coronavirus outbreak, the latest high-level summit between China and Africa took place virtually. Let's take a look at how that meeting went.
A summit calling for solidarity against COVID-19 between China and African countries. It also extends an invite to leaders of United Nations and the World Health Organization to strengthen global cooperation to overcome the pandemic. A moment of silence was observed for those who have tragically passed away due to COVID-19 before the Chinese president delivered a keynote speech.
At such a critical moment in the global fight against COVID-19, we are gathered together in this extraordinary China-Africa summit. Friends old and new are connected via video link to discuss our joint response to COVID-19 and to renew the fraternity between China and Africa.
Xi says China will lose no time in continuing to help African countries by providing medical supplies and experts. He says China's efforts also include helping build the Africa Centers for Disease Control headquarters and speeding up the construction of China-Africa Friendship Hospitals. The Chinese leader adds African countries will be among the first to benefit from the COVID-19 vaccine if one is successfully developed by Beijing. Xi said that China will cancel the debt of relevant African countries in the form of interest-free government loans that are due to mature by the end of 2020. And he says China will work with global partners, including the UN and the WHO, to assist Africa's response to COVID-19 while respecting the will of the peoples there.
China cherishes the traditional friendship with Africa. No matter how the international landscape may evolve, China shall never waver in its determination to pursue greater solidarity and cooperation with Africa.
Leaders from African countries, including those from South Africa and Nigeria, echoed Xi's speech. They vowed to increase solidarity, uphold multilateralism, strengthen Belt and Road cooperation, and accelerate follow-ups to the Foreign and China-Africa Cooperation Beijing Summit. They also say they're determined to uphold the UN-centered global governance system and support the WHO in making greater contributions to the global COVID-19 response.
I am convinced that humanity will ultimately defeat the virus and that the Chinese and African people are poised to embrace better days ahead.
A joint communique was released after the summit, vowing to take China and Africa's comprehensive, strategic, and cooperative partnership to greater heights. And it calls for more efforts to mobilize the necessary resources and do whatever it takes to protect people's lives and health and minimize the fallout of COVID-19. Zheng Yibing, CGTN, Beijing.
And to help us unpack this week's developments from the extraordinary China-Africa Summit on solidarity against COVID-19 is Professor Fu Jun. He's the Academic Dean at the Institute of South-South Cooperation and Development at Peking University. Welcome, Professor, to this discussion, and thank you for joining us on Talk Africa. Now, this week, President Xi Jinping and African leaders held an extraordinary summit on solidarity together, China and Africa. President Xi Jinping described the virtual session as taking place at a critical moment in the global fight against the pandemic. Professor, what is your understanding of the significance of this summit coming at this time?
Well, you know, this is so important because COVID-19 is not a disease against one country. It's a disease against all countries. The world is very connected. And if there is one country left without being triumphant in fighting the disease, all countries will be affected. So this is so important for us to join hands together. And when you compare developed and developing countries, even though you consider a time gap for the spread of the disease, eventually less developed countries will be more vulnerable. And unless those vulnerable, less prepared countries finally beat the disease, we cannot say that we here in China beat the disease. So it is so important for us to strengthen the cooperation between China and Africa countries, and for that matter, to strengthen cooperation with the countries all over the world to fight the disease.
There were a lot of measures that were announced by President Xi Jinping to assist Africa, and one of the issues that came out was the speeding up of the setting up of the African CDC, and that will be fast-tracked to be set up this year. How do you see this, though, improving Africa's response to the pandemic or African responses to future epidemics?
Well, this is very critical if we look at the Chinese experience of crisis management. And if I look at the case of SARS that took place in 2003, and it is so critical to set up an institutional arrangement that we call CDC, because when you deal with the public health crisis, basically you have to deal with what we call either black swans or gray rhinos. We are facing threats, and it is so important for us to have institutions set up like CDC to be there, to be technically, organizationally prepared in terms of surveillance, in terms of information, to recognize that threat is coming, so that we are in a better position to fight those public and global epidemics. Now, CDC will be in the very front line, and to contain those diseases, the expediency and the readiness in terms of information, technical information, scientific information is so critical. This is sort of the first move. Then you will consider, is the system ready in terms of strategic reserve? Then is the system ready in terms of response? And ultimately, will the system be ready in terms of recovery? So when you see those phases of crisis management, CDC is so critical.
Right. Let's look at the issue of multilateralism, Professor Fu Jun, because there was a strong call for protection of multilateralism. Now, the world is undergoing profound changes, unseen in a century. What opportunities and challenges do Africa and China face? And why do these, more than ever before, call for cooperation between China and Africa?
Well, when under great stresses of pressure, and there is tend to be a tendency for some to go alone. But I think it's a nearsighted approach. Ultimately, it is through win-win scenarios that we can deal with common threats like the disease better. And in the context of that, it is very critical to emphasize multilateralism rather than unilateralism. And the unilateralism, given the nature of the disease, won't beat the disease anyway. So at this moment, it makes sense to remind the people that multilateralism is the way to go to fight a disease of the nature of COVID-19. This is a disease against the whole mankind. And another way of saying is to fight a disease against the whole mankind is multilateralism. That's the way I see it.
Well, how do you see China and Africa, though, working together to uphold multilateralism and defend the UN-centered global governance system into the future?
Well, China is an emerging economy, and now when you look at its, the size of GDP, it's number 2. But when you multiply that size by the size of population, GDP per capita continue to be low. We are somewhere a little bit below average in that aspect. But being a big country, China has the responsibility to maintain this global system. And in that context, it makes a lot of sense for us to emphasize multilateralism. And China, by the way, now can serve as a bridge between the advanced part of the world and the less advanced part of the world because of the size of our economy. And if you just look at GDP per capita of a small country, you compare that with China, the similar level, probably a small country, a smaller country cannot play that role. Given the size of China, China is in the position to play that role. And that role means connecting different parts of the world. And here, a big part of that picture is to connect China with your continent. And this is a very critical role for China to play.
So if China has the responsibility, the greatest responsibility, a great responsibility in the global system, how do you see going forward now? What kind of critical role do you see China playing in the future in terms of its role in the global system?
Well, I guess in the future, the role that China should play should be consistent with the role that it has been played. In this moment, SARS is sort of came like a black swan, and it's very disruptive. But then I hope if we get over with that in the short or the medium term, then China should going back to the normal. The normal means that we should continue to play a bridge linking the advanced part of the world and the less advanced part of the world, so that the world economy is in a better place to move forward. Now, for the time being, you see a lot of negative growth in a way. It's non-growth and even negative growth. And China, fortunately, continued to score positive growth, even though our growth rates has also been dropped very dramatically. And as I said, I hope that we can get over with that by strengthening solidarity, and then we'll go back to the normal. Normal means we are all together and we should grow the world economy so that the prospects for the increased welfare of mankind will be improved.
So undoubtedly, though, the COVID-19 has dealt a massive impact on the economies of both China and African countries. So what can China and Africa do, though, together to revive their economies?
Well, it's not revive or not revive. You have to deal with that very cautiously, and you have to sort of move forward a little bit in terms of doing the economy, but at the same time, you need to watch out very carefully with the credible information coming from organizations like CDC. And in a way, you have to be very resilient. Once you are too aggressive on the economic side, you probably need to come back a little bit. For instance, now here in Beijing, well, it seems we have more cases now, but fortunately, because of the credible information, scientific information we had in this case, we moved much more rapidly than before. And hopefully we contain that in a timely fashion. And that gives the economy a better chance to recover. So it is really a very cautious move of moving forward. And hopefully we strike a good balance between the two fronts. One is the front of fighting the disease. The other is the front of growing the economy. And I guess that logic will apply to other parts of the world. And since the world is so interconnected, you're talking about the chains of global production, and we are connected. So to reach out to your part of the world also help the Chinese economy to grow. And the Chinese economy, for Chinese economy to grow, it also helps for your part of the world to grow as well. So we are connected. We should strengthen solidarity.
So, Professor Fu Jun, this summit was a great show of solidarity between China and Africa, particularly at this time of the pandemic. How do you see the evolution of China and Africa partnership going forward in terms of health cooperation, politically and economically?
I tend to see, I do not sort of separate politics and economics. The way I look at politics and economy is it's a political economy system, you know. The way that we have to apply for visas to travel means the politics is there. After all, it's not just one village, so you can travel freely. Somehow, nation states will have their own interests to take care of. But given that, can we move freer so that we increase the chance for the movements of production to going around the world, so that we increase the level of efficiency, so that we produce better goods with fewer resources, and that's the way to go. And to do that, ultimately, it's a game of political economy. And the logic is there, and hopefully we can create all sorts of win-win scenarios for every parts of the world, so that we increase the welfare of mankind. As I said, we are interconnected.
All right, indeed. Professor Fu Jun, thank you very much for your insights today on Talk Africa. That is Professor Fu Jun, the Academic Dean at the Institute of South-South Cooperation and Development at Peking University. We'll take a short break now, but do stay tuned. Talk Africa continues in a moment.
Life moves pretty fast. Ideas move at the speed of sound. Technology moves at the speed of light. If you don't filter out the noise, you might miss the details. We pay attention to the details because they matter, showing you a different perspective. See the difference.
Well, joining us to expound on the significance of Africa's health cooperation with China in the fight against COVID-19 is Dr. James Ogutu, a microbiologist at the Kenyatta University School of Medicine in Nairobi. Dr. Ogutu, thank you for joining us on the program. I want to start by looking at the virtual session that took place this week, the summit that took place between Chinese President Xi Jinping and African leaders. Chinese President Xi Jinping described it as a historic virtual session taking place at a critical moment in the global fight against the pandemic. How critical is the fight against COVID-19 for Africa, and how critical is the partnership between China and Africa in fighting the pandemic for the continent?
Thank you so much, Beatrice Marshall, for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts. I think the fight against COVID-19 pandemic is a very critical fight, not only for Africa, but for the world. As you have seen, the numbers have consistently been rising. And in the case of Africa, you could see for our own country, Kenya, the numbers of confirmed cases, the numbers of deaths are actually rising. So it would be very important if we could have our concerted efforts focused to the fight against COVID-19. So it's a very critical time for us. Although our numbers are not as high as we see down south in South Africa, our numbers are consistently rising. So that is something to worry about. So this fight should consistently continue, and getting partners to help us fight is a step in the right direction.
So let's look at that partnership, Dr. Ogutu, because a number of measures were announced by President Xi Jinping, and a lot of financial support was also announced by the president. So in which areas do you think resources that China is making available should be channeled to Africa? In which areas do you think Africa needs those resources in?
I think, number one, we need to get the real picture of the extent of the pandemic in Africa. And to get that picture, we need testing, mass testing. So I think one of the most important aspects to look at with any kind of help or assistance from our partners would be about testing, to get the testing kits to all counties, like for instance in Kenya, get the testing kits everywhere in sufficient numbers so that testing is not a problem anymore. But apart from that, we also need the government and the partners to look at those who are infected. Some of the people who are infected are not very well off, not very well to do. And so bearing the costs of testing and costs of hospitalization is something that needs to be taken care of. But apart from that, we also have our frontline workers in the healthcare sector, the doctors. Their protection is very, very important. So it is also important that some of that money could go to what you call as the personal protective equipment, the protective gears for the doctors that handle the patients in the hospital. So those three, I think, for me, are very, very key areas that we need to look at.
So China also announced the fast tracking of an African CDC this year. How important is an Africa Center for Disease Control for Africa, and how important will this be in stemming future epidemics or improving Africa's response to epidemics?
I think one of the areas or one of the institutions within China that was very, very effective in stemming up the spread of COVID-19 in China was the Chinese CDC. And it was very, very instrumental, especially in contact tracing. And I think an equivalent of that in Kenya to do the contact tracing would be very important. But you must also know that Centers for Disease Prevention and Control do much, much more than contact tracing. There are centers that are basically the places or the institutions where research is done. So this will enhance the research capacity. This research capacity would be very useful in actually studying and researching on the emerging infectious diseases. You know that COVID-19 is an emerging infectious disease, and apart from that, you also know that when we have these centers for disease prevention and control in Africa, they'd be very, very useful for infectious disease surveillance. So the surveillance aspect would be very helpful in trying to prevent future infections.
All right. So one other key issue that came up was President Xi's commitment to give Africa a priority as a beneficiary once a vaccine is available and ready for deployment. If this does eventually happen, of course, many will be asking, how do you see this changing the fight against COVID-19? How do you see this changing this difficult COVID-19 challenge for Africa?
It is significant that the president of China is talking about, is considering seriously the development of a vaccine against COVID-19. As you may know that for us to prevent infections and to prevent the spread, we need to boost our immunity, and a vaccine does precisely that. So the race against development of a vaccine that will be effective against COVID-19 is a welcome news. And we know today that it is not only China that is working on the same. The Chinese are working on the same and considering it very seriously. The Americans are doing something towards the same. And we also know that in Europe, a lot of efforts are being made towards coming up with a vaccine against COVID-19. This vaccine would be very useful. You know that vaccination and immunization in the past has been very useful in controlling, preventing, and even eradicating infections. We are almost kicking polio out of the world because of vaccination. Smallpox has already been kicked out of the world because of vaccination. Likewise, it is also believed that although it may not be possible to kick out COVID-19 and coronavirus infections because of other factors like the different strains that exist and the variations in their genomes and so on and so forth, but it would be very useful in helping to control the disease.
So what do you expect to see moving forward before this vaccine is deployed in Africa, whether it is from China, from the USA, or from Africa's efforts? What do you expect to see before this vaccine is deployed in Africa?
Beatrice, just 2 words. I would expect due diligence. I would expect that any partner that is bringing a vaccine to Africa, and to Kenya for that matter, would make sure that the clinical trials have already been done in their countries of origin. And I would also expect that the receiving or the recipient countries would do due diligence in testing the efficiency of the vaccine, but apart from that, also making sure that the vaccine does not bring any health risk to anybody who is going to receive it. So due diligence would be one of the most important things, both for those that are going to assist, the partners that are going to help with the development, as well as the recipient countries.
So you have talked, Dr. Ogutu, you've said partnerships at this point, at this critical juncture when Africa is battling COVID-19 is very welcome. Moving forward, how do you see the evolution of this partnership between China and Africa, particularly in the area of health cooperation?
Actually, it is very important to note that in the recent past, the relationship between China and the African continent has been very warm. For your own information, if you may wish to know, Africa, China is already receiving a lot of students, postgraduate students, that are actually studying in Chinese universities, institutes, and institutions. And many of them are in either biomedical science research, some are in engineering, the rest are also in studying medicine. So I'm seeing this partnership between China and Africa actually getting better in the future.
All right, Dr. Ogutu joining us there via Skype from Nairobi. Thank you very much for your insight. Well, that is all we have time for this week. A big thank you to Dr. James Ogutu for sharing your thoughts, as well as Professor Fu Jun earlier on in the program. And thank you too for tuning in to this episode of Talk Africa. I would love to hear your feedback on this topic through our social media handles on Facebook and Twitter. And you can also catch this and more episodes of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist and the CGTN Africa website. We'll keep the conversation going and tune in again next week. From me, Beatrice Marshall, it's goodbye.